He was quite cross, Jean-Paul Marat. Nonetheless, he became extraordinarily popular. And these people, I mean, there were many, many others, of course, along with Camus Desmoulins, were the sort of most vibrant characters at this point. Now, as we said, also, of course, at this point, it transformed the whole of this society, even as far as the island of San Domingo. The extraordinary thing that happened was that the slaves, it was quite complicated, but the slaves heard about all this, and they more or less said, well, if they're having a revolt, then it's our duty to sort of join in. After all, we are the slaves. And the only way they could meet and discuss things at all was when they had voodoo council meetings, which the masters didn't attend, probably wise in their case. And the slave revolt began, which easily be the subject of a very long meeting itself. But I'll just sort of talk about it with this one quote, one of my favourite quotes from a history book, from a fantastic book called The Black Jacobins, about the slave revolt that accompanied the French Revolution, by a chap called C.L.R. James, who was also a big fan of cricket, as you should be. And make the ball bounce. It's obvious. And C.L.R. James wrote this about the slave revolt, and I love this partly because it sort of gives you a sense of it, but also because it's mad. He said, "The slaves did as they were taught. In the frenzy of the first encounters, they killed all. Vengeance, vengeance was their cry, and one of them carried a white head on a pike as a standard. And yet they were surprisingly moderate." Now, every area of the world was transformed. Extraordinary. I mean, certainly in Britain, there was one chap in particular, I'll just sort of mention for a bit, because he is clearly relevant to America, who transformed society and was transformed by this, was Tom Paine, who was, amazing, because he managed to be involved in sort of 3 revolutions, if you like, which is, makes you slightly jealous. He came over here, hardly did anything of note till he was 37, came over here, wrote a book called Common Sense, and of course had a huge impact in the development of your country. And one of the things I love about him as well is I saw that because he influenced George Washington enormously. George Washington wasn't a supporter of total independence up until Paine's book, and in his memoirs, Paine notes that, or in his diary, in fact, at the time, he said, "George Washington is coming round to see me tomorrow. I shall offer him a crust of bread and some cheese." Now, coming from a country as I do, where the Prime Minister over the last few years, whenever the American President has come round, has offered him somewhat more than a crust of bread and some cheese, and just about anything whatsoever that he could possibly want, so far up his arse does he crawl. The idea of the American president coming round and going, "Oh, you can have a crust of bread and some cheese. I've got the King of Spain tomorrow, he's getting a bowl of sugar puffs." So it's a fantastic idea if you're British. Paine wrote this extraordinary book called The Rights of Man, defending the French Revolution. 2 extraordinary things about it. First of all, just the clarity of it. No one had written political books for the common person before. It was an extraordinary book in the clarity of it. He wrote, for example, at one point, the idea of a hereditary ruler is as absurd as the idea of a hereditary mathematician. Which is a good joke for 200 years ago. And he worked out exactly how much money there was in Britain and how this could be distributed if you didn't have a royal family to pay for and the aristocracy. Exactly. Even worked out ideas such as there should be hostels for the homeless. Things that are radical now. That there should be a sort of the beginnings of a welfare state, he worked out. He even worked out, he said that most people, as they get to a certain age, their greatest fear is that they won't be able to afford a decent funeral, and the state should be able to pay for everybody's funeral. Now, incredible radical. Even now, you imagine a right-wing paper being annoyed about that, couldn't you? We uncover the cheats deliberately dying to get their free coffin. There's incredibly radical ideas. And the amazing thing, Paine then, the other amazing thing about the book, its popularity was extraordinary. Throughout Britain, it became the best-selling book in history ever up until that point. Remarkable, except for the Bible. Extraordinary. Even though most working people couldn't read, there were meetings in virtually every town, in the back rooms of pubs and halls everywhere, where people would meet up and they would get someone who could read, obviously, to read out out passages every night of the rights of man. People would hide it underneath boulders and all this sort of thing, meet up secretly at night to read these passages. Extraordinary. Spies were sent out everywhere. You could be hung, drawn and quartered for publishing this book. It was remarkable. He was accused of everything. He was accused of preaching atheism by the establishment. I mean, apart from anything else, how do you preach atheism? How do you do that? Do you knock on the doors of religious people on Sunday mornings? And then when they answer, say, have you heard the bad news? The impact was extraordinary. And of course there was nothing else he could do but to flee. He had to flee, and the place he fled to was France, where he was immediately elected as a member of the Revolutionary Assembly, and then did something wonderfully English. Having become a member of the Revolutionary French Assembly, refused to learn a word of French, which makes me proud. But in France, of course, there were all these developments now, the tensions coming out. The royal family had moved to Versailles. They didn't trust the people of Paris, so they moved out to a special place in Versailles, well, the palace, their palace in Versailles, where it would be easier for them to flee if they wanted to. And indeed, they were trying to organise the royal families of the rest of Europe to create armies that would come in and invade their own country and get rid of this elected assembly and put them back to their rightful place, as they saw it, as the sole arbiters of law in France. And the people didn't trust them. In particular, the women didn't trust them. There was an extraordinary march of 10,000 women armed that went to Versailles Palace from Paris, and they grabbed hold of the royal families. This is where Marie Antoinette was supposed to have said, let them eat cake. And they were grabbed by the women and taken back to Paris in the most extraordinary fashion. In fact, the king was made to wear a liberty cap, the liberty cap that was designed to commemorate the French Revolution. He was made to wear it all the way back. Extraordinary demonstration that must have been. It was the equivalent of forcing Donald Rumsfeld to march through Harlem selling socialist workers. Extraordinary humiliation, if you like. And so the royal family then tried to escape. Run out of time for the escape. It's an extraordinary story, though. They dressed as Russians and tried to escape and were stopped by a postmaster. An amazing story. And having tried to escape, they weren't just trying to escape the revolution to save their own lives. They were trying to get across the border in order to help the royal armies invade their own country, as I said. And at this point, now, when it was clear they were trying to do that, especially when a load of documents were found in which it was clear that the king and Marie Antoinette had been trying to organise this invasion of their own country, it was absolutely clear that something needed to be done about this and that the royal family couldn't be trusted. Even so, they were still allowed to carry on being king and queen for another year. When the documents were found, that was pretty much it, and they were jailed and a republic was set up. And as this republic was set up, though, of course, the first thing it had to do was deal with the fact that now these royal families, the armies of the royal families, were invading. And they invaded from all angles. And the chap called the Duke of Brunswick was head of these royal armies. And he was 3 days' march away from Paris. And, of course, people must have been absolutely terrified, not least of which because the Duke of Brunswick issued a proclamation in which he said, anyone who may dare to defend themselves against the troops of their imperial and royal majesties will find their houses pulled down and burnt. The town of Paris and all its inhabitants without distinction shall be bound to submit on the spot and without any delay to the king. The royal family must be restored to the respect to which the laws of nature entitle sovereigns. Otherwise an exemplary and never to be forgotten vengeance will be taken and the town of Paris given up to military execution. So all of the stuff about the guillotine, which I'll come on to in a moment, all of that, however gruesome and brutal it was, has to be seen against this. People were terrified. Here was this chap just 3 days' march away with his army. The French Revolution's army had collapsed. The French army didn't exist. The nobles had all been, the officers were all nobles. They'd all gone. They took all the stuff. And so a mass of people from Paris were just organised again, but now even more, with even more urgency, to go out and take on the Duke of Brunswick's troops. And the Duke of Brunswick, along with the Prime Minister Pitt of Britain, all the royal families at the time, issued all very, very similar statements that sort of thing you might recognise, whereby they said, this really won't take long, this war, because there's just a handful of insurgents We will clearly be welcomed as liberators. They've been issuing pikes of mass destruction. It is absolutely clear that we will move in there, we will set up our own government, we will leave very, very quickly. All of this thing, it is absolutely extraordinary and uncanny how similar it is that they just couldn't believe that people might get annoyed themselves at another country's army coming in and occupying it. Someone must be telling them to get annoyed. When you get this, I'm sure it's happening here now. It's been happening in Britain over the last 6 months, a year or so. We're almost now, everybody who supported it one by one, the journalists and the politicians, are bit by bit. OK, yes, I admit it, I confess, I was rather naive. I did think that we would be welcomed, and I didn't realise there wouldn't be any weapons there, and I thought a link might be found with Saddam and Al-Qaeda, and a bit of me thinks, well, at least they're owning up to it, so that's fair enough. Although another bit of me thinks all these people should be put in a huge classroom with a teacher at the front who walks up and down going, now come along, why didn't we learn this last time? We've been through it enough times. What happens when the Americans invade somewhere, you boy? Come on, out with it. Out with it. Clearly they fuck everything up and make things worse, sir. They fuck everything up and make things worse, sir. Now learn it for next time. And that's exactly as it was at the time, exactly as it was. They believed this was just a handful of people, and clearly it wasn't. And when this sort of impromptu army went out and saw off the Duke of... They didn't beat the Duke of Brunswick's army, but they managed to withstand him for 3 days. And this was clearly transformed the way that people thought all around the world, on both sides of the divide. And then this enormous war and all the brutality of a civil war in those circumstances took place. It was also the time, though, that the most extraordinary radicalism took place, as the radicals took charge of the French Revolution, Robespierre and Danton and Marat and Camille Desmoulins and such people. I mean, well, God, I don't know where to start. They did start to institute the idea of a welfare state. Voting took place. I mean, the idea of voting for anybody a few months earlier would have been seen as just completely ridiculous. Now you voted for officers in the army, you voted for magistrates. Danton made a speech where he said, after bread, the most important thing a man can have is education. And he didn't mean education so you get your exams and then get a good job where you earn more money, which is how they justify the fees or anything like that. With the idea of modern society, of modern governments, thinking education is just a brilliant thing in and of itself, that it's a wonderful thing to learn about history or learn a language or about maths or whatever, just because that's a brilliant thing to do. Completely anathema to these people. On every front, all this sort of radicalism and... even the most extraordinary thing, Robespierre, for example, while he was the most important person at the moment, the most powerful person in this revolutionary convention, was lodging at his friend's house, his family, they're called the Duplays, who were carpenters. Now, a few months earlier, that was not the case. The king did not lodge in somebody's house. He had more palaces than he could count and then bought more. And the most extraordinary radicalism, therefore, that took place in all this, and none more so than over the issue of slavery. Because a colonist's agent wrote, now first of all, before I'll say what they did, just the atmosphere in France at the time, a colonist's agent said, one spirit alone reigns here. It is horror for slavery and an enthusiasm for liberty. It is a frenzy which wins all heads and grows all day. That's extraordinary because, of course, as people began to feel a sense of their own strength, of course, it doesn't just mean that people go off and do all that they can for themselves. People begin to feel that they can do things for other people, people who they will never know, faces they could never possibly see on the other side of the ocean at the time. But they feel a sense of commitment and fraternity, if you like, to these other people. And so slavery was abolished. Now, I find this an extraordinary thing that this isn't better known. I mean, the French Revolution abolished slavery is a wonderful statement in the comments of the time, where as the Assembly abolished this, it says, a citizen of colour who attends our sittings every day felt such joy at seeing this moment that she has fainted. And they then go on to say it is we are remorseful at how we didn't take it upon ourselves to abolish slavery earlier. But I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. And Sharma's book, 900 pages, not a single mention that this took place. Religion, extraordinary again, how people's minds were changed to such an extent that the religion of the time changed. The Notre Dame was renamed the Temple of Reason, and at funerals people were sent to eternal sleep. All this sort of thing. I'll just read out how the Lord's Prayer they rewrote. The Lord's Prayer was rewritten to go like this. Our Father, who are in heaven, from whence you protect in such an admirable manner the French Republic and the sans-culottes. Give us today the bread we eat despite the efforts of British Prime Minister Pitt and tyrants who unite to keep us hungry. So, all of these things, however, of course, have to be measured against one other thing, which was that the terror did take place. Now, one thing about the terror, the number of people killed by the guillotine in Paris in the terror was about 2,700, something like that. Which is clearly not in the first division of historical slaughters. There's far more people being killed in a day, in various slaughters that we can all recite. I mean, however, that isn't to justify it. I was just thinking, if you were up in court for murdering 4 of your neighbours, it wouldn't get you very far if you said, yeah, but I mean, there were 60,000 killed in one day in the Battle of the Somme, Your Honour, so let's keep this in perspective. But Of all the things that have happened, it's extraordinary that this is remembered more than any other. More importantly, though, I think it has to be remembered that this was in the context of this war. It was part of the war, the terror. People didn't trust. If you were in Paris and you didn't trust someone to defend you, if the Duke of Brunswick's armies or any of these other, the Prussian or the British army, arrived in Paris with their exemplary, never-to-be-forgotten vengeance, could you trust the people next door to you? Could you trust all these people to defend you rather than to grass you up to what would then be these brutal royalist authorities? And that, it seems to me, is the explanation for a great deal of the terror. Not necessarily to justify it, and of course the most terrible things happened, but it has to be seen in that context. And of course people panic as well in that context. And the other thing is that the bulk of the terror took place not against the aristocracy, but as the factions started to fall apart, as the French Revolution, as the momentum of it started to fall apart. And it fell apart mostly because once the war was won, once the war sort of began to be won, then a great many of the people, of the wealthier people, the people that wanted this new scientific world, a rational world, a world in which you didn't just make laws because the royal family happened to be sitting on their silly bit of furniture. These people, a lot of the money-making people, they started to withdraw their support. They wanted this new society, but they didn't want all the radicalism. They didn't want all the stuff about welfare states and education, and many of them didn't want to abolish slavery because they were making a lot of money out of it. And they started to withdraw support, and at that point, the French Revolution did begin to collapse. It's obviously much more complex than that, but that's a sort of shorthand way of saying it. And then, of course, as it started to collapse, the factions started turning in on each other. The most extraordinary things, accusations were made against each other and so on. Danton ended up falling out with Robespierre, most awful manner, and to the extent that Robespierre had Danton executed. And Danton did get to make a speech where he said, at 33 I am to be executed at the same age as the sans-culotte Jesus. And it didn't really do Robespierre much good. A few weeks after that, Robespierre himself was dragged out by much more conservative people who took over the revolution, and Robespierre was executed as well. And this new group of people that didn't want the return of the royal family, they didn't want the return of a society based on what your family was. They wanted a new society where money was king, if you like, rather than bloodline. But without any of the radicalism, they began to take over. And eventually there was one person who, above all else, was able to institute that sort of society, and that was Napoleon. Oh, amazing, again, the thing known more than anything else about Napoleon, well, he was short. This sort of amazing way of looking at history that you go, oh yeah, the Napoleon complex, he was short, that's what, amazing. I mean, he wasn't even short, he was, for the time, he was 5'6", but even if he was, the idea that he was going, oh, I can't reach the top shelf. Oh no, I'll invade Italy, that'll fucking sort that out. It was an extraordinary idea. And Napoleon did go around Europe setting up republics. He abolished various fiefdoms and feudal societies, and he set up republics in their place. He didn't do it mostly, though, out of any great empathy with the poor. He did it in order that his mates and him could make a lot of money out of these places. Nonetheless, he remained an inspiration for people around the world until such point as he declared himself emperor, and that, as sellouts go, that pretty much sealed it. And so, what was it all for then? He even went mad. I mean, there's the extraordinary thing. He even went completely crazy. He was absolutely determined in the end that he couldn't lose any military battles because he was being advised by a little red genie. And then when he said that he consulted the red genie about invading Russia, and the red genie said not to do it, but I'm going to ignore him and do it anyway. Now that's a special sort of megalomania, isn't it? You don't just invent a little genie, you then go, the genie's telling me he thinks he knows best, fuck him. I'm Napoleon! I mean, the tragedy of all this at the end then is, well, what was the outcome of all this? What was the point of it all then? And of course, this is where so many historians, they then say, well, there, all this big skirmish, everybody went a bit wild, all the pamphlets, yeah. It ended up exactly the same. And this is a great big argument, and I shall just try and deal with it in just 2 or 3 sentences. First of all, well, it simply wasn't the same because there hasn't been a royal family there ever since. And that, I think, in and of itself is an improvement, because if you adore the royal families, you don't get this. If we get this in Britain, aren't they marvellous? It's complex, and it's a declining number of people slowly, but nonetheless, there's another side to people going, isn't it marvellous? And they turn up at Windsor Castle and they wave the little flags, and aren't they radiant, aren't they glorious? Another side to that is what it does for people's self-esteem. If you look up to someone just because they were born in that family and therefore you think they're marvellous, the other side of that, of what you're saying is, I'm shit though, aren't I? Because what am I? I'm just useless. I'm just born in a non-royal family. And that, therefore, is a good thing, it seems to me, that there is no royal family. Secondly, if it's the case that every time a movement fails in its aims, and indeed they were sort of groping towards their aims as they went along in the French Revolution, at what point should we give up? Should we not do anything? Should nobody ever resist injustice or inequality in any way? Every time some bully or tyrant exercises their bullying or tyrannical methods, should we just ignore them because, well, you don't know how this is going to end up? Of course not. And one of the reasons is, and this I think is the most important thing in a way, because, of course, you can always look at where movements didn't achieve their aims and where it left a sort of in its wake all this depression because people think, well, it didn't get where it wanted to. But what you should always ask, it seems to me, is what would have happened if there had been no resistance? If no one had fought back? If no one at the time? We would still be swishing bloody frogs if people were doing that. A very, very pertinent question, of course, because with the anti-war movement, so often, I'm sure this is the case here, you get it in Britain, fantastic movement. I mean, we had a sort of, we're slightly staggered with our movements, but we had this extraordinary march, far and away the biggest demonstration in the whole of British history. So often, that's bad when the chair leaves, isn't it? You've even bored the organisers, that's terrible. So many people that were part of that movement, of course, then say, what did it do? What purpose was there? They had the war. We were called Stop the War and we didn't stop the war. And of course that's the case, and of course it's depressing and frustrating. But I think it should also be put alongside another question. What would have happened if there'd been no resistance, no marches, no protests, if none of those extraordinary global scenes had took place? How many wars would there be if they knew that they could get away with it without anybody ever protesting about it? That's another question to ask, I think, as well. God knows where they would have bloody well invaded by now if nobody had stood up to the one that we didn't stop, if you like. So, of course, it makes an enormous difference. And it also made an enormous difference because it changed society in how people felt as individuals, as what their worth was as an individual. And I'll just finish with this quote, because no one, I think, started by talking about some of the great characters who adored the French Revolution, and Beethoven was certainly one of those. Beethoven's whole life really reflected the spirit of the French Revolution, the depression of Napoleon becoming an emperor, and the spirit of the French Revolution in its early days and so on. And Beethoven, I think, summed up the spirit of how an individual could see themselves as a result of the French Revolution, even after its defeat. He was employed by a chap called Prince Lichnowsky, and the prince just sort of ordered him to do whatever he wanted. And at one point he said, I want you to come round and do an extra day's recital for me tonight. I'm having some friends round. And Beethoven said, I'm not coming, I'm writing a symphony. And the prince said, but I'm telling you, I'm the prince, and I'm telling you, you've got to come and do it. And Beethoven resigned with what I think is the most magnificent resignation letter. And I'll just finish with this because I think it is the spirit of the time. Prince, You are what you are, not from anything you've achieved, but purely by birthright. Remember, though, that there will always be hundreds of Princes, but there will only ever be one Beethoven. Thanks very much.